Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, hi, I post true crime content like this all the time. So if that's something you're interested in, hit that like button, subscribe while you're at it, and put your post notifications on so you know when I upload a brand new video. Today we're going to be talking about Diane Downs. So the content warnings for this video are, it's about the murder of a child and just like attacks on children. So if that's something you can't watch, there's a playlist on my channel for more videos. So let's go on with the case. Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson was born on the 7th of August 1955 in Phoenix, Arizona in the United States to her parents Wes and Willardine Fredrickson. She was born into a very conservative family. She followed their beliefs up until around the age of 14, where she started going through a rebellious teen, as most do. She ended up dropping her first name Elizabeth and decided to go by her middle name, which was Diane. In the 1970s, she graduated from Moon Valley High School in Phoenix, and there she met a guy named Steve Downs. Steve was her old neighbour. They had a brief fling in high school until he graduated and went their separate ways. Diane attended the Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College and Steve went and joined the Navy. They promised each other to keep the relationship going long distance and that they were going to stay faithful to each other. Diane was actually kicked out of the college she was attending and had to move back in with her parents because she was being pretty promiscuous and sleeping with a lot of the men or the boys in the college. At this time, when Diane moved back to Arizona to live with her parents, Steve happened to be finished in the Navy, and had also moved back to Arizona. So they decided to rekindle their relationship. On the 13th of November 1973, Steve and Diane got married, making Diane Fredrickson now Diane Downs. Their marriage was very toxic. They argued because Steve was a bit paranoid about Diane cheating on him again, which is understandable. The marriage ends in divorce in 1980. During their short-lived marriage, Steve and Diane had 3 children together. In 1974, their first child, a daughter, named Christy Ann. In 1976, their second daughter, Cheryl Lynn, was born. And then finally in 1979, their son, Stephen Daniel, was born, and they used to call him Danny. 6 months after their first baby was born, which was Christy, Diane decided to up and move away, and she joined the Navy, while Steve was left behind alone to take care of the kids. But Diane only ended up lasting 3 weeks in the Navy, and then their second daughter, Cheryl, was born. After the birth of Cheryl, Steve decided that he didn't want any more children, and he goes and gets a vasectomy, which means he can not provide Diane with any more children. Keep this in mind. I bet you were thinking, wait, don't they have a third child? And you would be correct. So Diane fell pregnant in 1997 because she'd cheated on Steve. She ended up getting an abortion, and even through all of this, Steve still stayed with her. In 1978, the Downs family moved to Mesa, Arizona, and they both, Steve and Diane, started working at a mobile home manufacturing company. And again, Diane was cheating on poor Steve with several of her colleagues. One of these affairs caused Diane to fall pregnant again with baby Stephen, or known as Danny. Steve knew that obviously Danny wasn't his biological one because of the vasectomy, but he treated and raised him like his own son. Steve says he only stayed with Diane for as long as he did because solely for the benefit of his children. Diane says that after her abortion, she had immense regret and could not cope with what she had done to her baby, which is funny when you figure out what she does later on. She had seen an anti-abortion booth and saw all the pictures of the fetuses, and this made her feel very regretful of what she had done. The way she believed that she could right her wrong was by having another baby. So obviously Steve had the vasectomy, so she couldn't get it that way, so she had to find another way. The father of Steve and Danny was one of her work colleagues, a man named Mark Sager. Steve could not cope with being married to Diane anymore, so in 1980, that is when they divorced. Diane kept trying to reconcile her relationship with Steve, however, she was continuing to see other men, which is probably not the best way to go around about trying to reconcile a relationship. You'd think if you're trying to get back with someone, you want to see other people to show how committed to them you are. But Diane's like, I'm gonna do my thing. So Diane is now a single mother with a low income. So in her head she decides, what am I good at? Getting pregnant. So she decides she wants to become a surrogate. She actually failed 2 psychiatric assessments which would allow her to be eligible to be a surrogate. Having a strong mental state while being a surrogate is important because carrying someone else's baby and then you have to give it up. So you've got to be pretty mentally strong for that. Tests actually showed that Diane was very intelligent, but she seemed to be psychotic. In 1981, she started working for the US Postal Service. She needed help with her kids and they would take turns living in separate houses in the week. They stayed with Steve, they stayed with Diane's parents, and they even stayed at Mark Sager's house, who is Danny's father. So, these 3 families would take turns in rotation of housing these 3 children. Neighbours of Diane's report that when the children were staying with her, that they weren't being cared for properly, and she was accused of leaving the children home alone while she was out with different men. The oldest child, Christy, was left to take care of herself and her 2 younger siblings. It was said by many people, Christy included, that Diane was an unfit mother, or she was unfit to be a mother, and put everything else above her children. Her second daughter, Cheryl, was treated the worst out of all her children, and she told neighbours that she was actually afraid of Diane. Diane was finally offered a job to be a surrogate, and that was paid in about $10,000. On the 8th of May 1982, Diane gave birth to the surrogate daughter, and after this she actually attempted to open up her own surrogacy agency, but this was over before it even started. At this time, Diane was part of a very serious affair with a man named Robert Knickerbocker, who was known as Nick. They met at the post office where they both worked together. This relationship broke down because Diane was constantly pressuring Nick to leave his wife to be with her. In 1983, at the age of 27, Diane picks up and moves to Oregon. But she was so obsessed with Nick that she would write him letters and visit him. Nick had made it very clear to Diane that he had no interest with being with her. In her diary, she wrote on the 21st of April, "I still think of you as my best friend and lover, and you keep telling me to go away and find someone else." On the 29th of April, she wrote, "It doesn't matter what Charlene thinks. I'm a little sad that she's convinced you the kids would be a burden, because I know it would not be true. Oh, Charlene is Nick's wife, by the way. On May 11th, 1983, she wrote, "I have 3 beautiful children that I love more than anyone else. I think I love them even more than you now. Danny says he's my best buddy, and I'm his best buddy. He always gives me kisses and hugs every morning when I go to work. He waves and says, 'Bye, Mommy. Pick me up after work. I love you.'" Diane then started to hate her children because she believed that Nick was somebody special and that her children were getting in the way of her being with Nick. Nick did not want children, and Diane believed that this was the reason that Nick ended the relationship, and because the kids were too much of a burden to him. So on the 19th of May 1983, the workers at Mackenzie Williams Hospital in Oregon were having a quiet shift. This is when a car rushes into the emergency department drop-off point. Diane runs into the hospital with a bloody towel wrapped around her arm, screaming, "Help! Somebody killed my children." The interior of Diane's car is covered in blood, and her 3 children, Christy, Cheryl and Danny, are all led on the back seat covered in blood. All 3 children had been shot at point-blank range. Cheryl was declared dead on arrival. Christy had suffered a huge stroke due to 2 gunshots to the chest, and Danny was paralysed from the waist down because the bullet had been lodged in his spine. Christy and Danny were rushed to intensive care, and the doctors and surgeons were finding it very difficult to save their lives. Diane was treated for a single gunshot wound to her forearm and was just sipping tea while her children were in surgery fighting for their lives. Diane was so calm during all of this. The nurses believed that she was just numb from the shock of the attack. The nurses told her that the doctors were doing all their best to save her children and that she would be able to see them soon. And to this she laughed and said, quote, "Only the best for my children, at least I've got good insurance." Not a single teardrop came from that woman's eyes. It's like she didn't care. When Diane was going for an x-ray, she was joking around saying how the police officers were going to see her without any makeup on, and was complaining about how she would have a scar and she was unable to tie her shoes until her arm was fully healed, which are really not things you should be thinking about. Like, why are you talking about how police officers are going to see you without makeup on when your kids have literally been shot and one's already been pronounced dead? That blows my mind. But the police questioned Diane about the events of that night. She says that they'd been to a friend's house and that they were on their way home at around 9:30 p.m. She saw a back road which she had never been down, so she decided to take the scenic route home to go sightseeing. Sightseeing at 9:30 p.m. with children? What do you mean? The children were asleep on the back seat, and "Hungry Like the Wolf" by Duran Duran was playing on the radio. Diane says she saw a scruffy-haired man standing on the roadside, and he was like signalling for her to pull over. She pulls the car over, takes out the keys out of the ignition and gets out. The man tells her that he wants her car, and she says to that, she kind of laughs to that and goes, "You got to be kidding me." He then shoves Diane, pulls out a gun, and then shoots the kids in the back seat. She says that she pretended to throw the keys into some bushes, and whilst the man was distracted, she pushes him, gets into the car, and then speeds to the hospital. She says that during the attack is when she received the gunshot wound in her left forearm. Diane ends up providing police with a profile sketch of the scruffy-haired man, but the police are starting to doubt Diane's story. Diane's gunshot wound was perfectly bandaged up by the time she had arrived at the hospital, and not a single drop of blood was on her right arm. Surprisingly, due to the amount of blood that was in the car, none of it had gotten on Diane, which is a bit suspicious, right? The police were also shocked at the lack of emotion she was showing. She seemed to not care or have no concern about any of her children's well-being. One of her children had already died, one was paralysed, and one had had a massive stroke. So you'd think she would have emotion, but no. She had no concern for their well-being. I mean, I guess different people react to trauma and shock in different ways, so I can't slate her on that. But, like, surely there's something going on. Not just like blank expression, joking around. Whilst the children were being treated, rather than being there for her kids, she thought that it was important to call Nick, informing her of the incident. She didn't even contact Steve or Mark, informing them of the attack on their own children. When nurses told Diane that Danny was paralysed, she said that she was surprised that the bullet had hit him in the spine and not his heart. When she was told Cheryl had unfortunately passed away, she had no emotion and was just cold. She also made some very stupid comments, such as, "This has really ruined my vacation." And she was really bothered about the fact that her new car was covered in blood. The public were very fearful of this scruffy-haired man who was out shooting and killing children. They were showing Diane lots of sympathy because they believed that this grieving mother had lost her children and she was just going through a very difficult time. Poor Diane. The police went and searched the crime scene and they found nothing except the bullet casings, which were from a .22 caliber gun. Diane did several interviews and she seemed super off, and the support from Diane just become less and less. 4 days after the attack, Diane was brought in by the police to do a reenactment of the attack. This was filmed, and while the cameras were on, Diane can be seen sorting out her hair and her makeup in the car mirror. So in this reenactment, Diane bumps her Cass and she starts to say, "That's worse than when." So, and then she stops herself and the police believe that she was going to say, "That's worse than when I shot myself." I'll play that clip now.
Sitting in the car is Elizabeth Diane Downs.
I'm throwing the keys, okay? I'm throwing the keys. I go like that. I got in the car, jumped in, put the keys in. I just hit my cast. Started the car and left. The car door shut itself. God, this is worse than... Okay.
Diane was loving all the attention and support she was receiving. She did many interviews and just talked a lot about her life and how she couldn't believe that it had happened to her. During a search of Diane's home, they found a .22 caliber cartridge in a rifle, and it hadn't been shot, and the letters that she had written to Nick. Diane had lied to the police, saying she did not own a .22 caliber gun, and Nick actually testified against her, saying he had seen a .22 caliber gun in the trunk boot if you're British, trunk if you're whatever. Yeah, what was I saying? He found it in a boot. Christy was still in the hospital after suffering a stroke from the gunshot wounds. She was unable to speak out, but nurses observed that every time Diane would come and visit her, that Christy's vitals would skyrocket, which implied to them just obvious signs of fear. Diane had also told the nurses to pull the plug on Christy because she knew that her daughter was brain dead. Obviously, the hospital refused to pull the plug because there was literally no evidence to support Dan's claim of Christy being brain dead. During forensic testing, it was found that there was no blood or gunpowder residue on the driver's side of the car. Nick had reported that Diane had been stalking him and was open to the idea of killing his wife Charlene. He said he was relieved when Diane had moved away because he could then try and fix his relationship with Charlene. The murder weapon has actually never been found, and the police determined that Diane's gun was purchased in Arizona, and they found the casings at her house with identical markings as the ones at the crime scene. Witnesses also say that Diane was driving to the hospital at a very slow pace, around 5, 6, 7 miles an hour, which is very, very slow, and this heavily contradicts Diane's story of her saying she sped to the hospital. 9 months after the attack, Diane Downs was arrested, and on the 28th of February, she was charged with 1 count of murder for Cheryl and 2 counts each of attempted murder and criminal assault for the attacks on Danny and Christy. In May of 1984, her trial begins, and Diane, being the attention whore she is, she surprises everyone. Diane rocks up to the court and she's pregnant again.
Police arrested Diane, and incredibly, she was pregnant once again. Throughout the trial, the public would see Diane being led to the courthouse in a maternity gown and handcuffs.
The public would see Diane being escorted to the courthouse in handcuffs and a maternity gown. She told a reporter that she got pregnant before she was arrested because she missed Christy, Cheryl and Danny so much that she knew that she couldn't replace them, but she could replace the effect that she had on her. In the court, the prosecution presented all the evidence, and in court, Diane showed how truly unbothered she was. They played Hungry Like the Wolf by Duran Duran, which was the same song which was played on the night of the attack. Diane's reaction to that was bopping her head up and down, stamping her feet to the beat of the music. She honestly couldn't give any less of a. Christy at this point had regained her ability to speak. She testified that the night her mother pulled over the car, shot her and then shot Cheryl, then Danny, and then shot herself in the arm. Christy was aged 9 when the trial took place, and she had to undergo lots of mental and physical therapy to be able to testify in court. The prosecution asked Christy who had shot her, and her answer was short but the most damning piece of evidence. She just stood there and said, "My mom," which there's no more evidence needs. The prosecution's believed motive was that Diane wanted the relationship with Nick so badly, and Nick had made it very clear that he didn't want children, and he didn't want her kids either. So she shot them to be free, and just to be free to be with Nick. In June of 1984, Diane Downs was found guilty on all charges, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment with an additional 50 years to be served at the Oregon Women's Correctional Center.
Later, her former husband would like to see her pay the ultimate price.
Executed. That's what I was hoping for. That's what I still feel that they should have done that, you know. We'd all be better off.
So, remember Diane was pregnant during the trial. She gave birth to a daughter who she named Amy Elizabeth, who was taken in by the state and then adopted by her family. Christy and Danny were actually adopted by a man named Fred Hughey, who was the prosecutor in the Diane Downs trial. Diane was diagnosed with antisocial and narcissistic personality disorders while she was in prison. On the 11th of July 1987, she was only 3 years into her sentence, Diane decided that she was done with prison life. So she climbed the prison fence and managed to escape for 10 days. She went to the house of Wayne Cypher, which was only 4 blocks away from the prison. Wayne was the ex-husband of a cellmate. They had a sexual relationship and hid together for 10 days until Diane was apprehended. Wayne says now that during these 10 days he fell in love with Diane, but Diane was then rearrested and an additional 5 years was added to her sentence for escape. To this day, Diane still claims that she is innocent of the crime. In 2020, she was actually eligible for parole, but fortunately she was denied. So that's the end of this video. If you enjoyed, comment what you thought of the case down below. Give it a like. If you want to subscribe, there'll be a picture with my face in it on the screen. If I can put my second channel one up, I'll put that too. And there'll be a playlist for more videos. Bye!